Everyone thinks the story ended when Frank went down. The arrests, the trials, the headlines. That's where the movies stop. But for those of us who stayed, who couldn't just walk away or disappear into witness protection or a new life somewhere clean, that's when it actually started. The real story. The one nobody wants to tell because there's no redemption in it, no lesson, no moral arc. Just what happens when the power disappears and you're still standing there, waiting for consequences that never stop coming. My name doesn't matter. I was never important enough to be named in indictments, never visible enough to be photographed by surveillance, never close enough to the money to be worth prosecuting. I was auxiliary. That's the word I learned later, in therapy. Auxiliary. Essential but replaceable. I kept things running in the small ways that big operations need. I answered phones. I ran errands. I knew people's real names and their street names and which ones never mixed. I remembered birthdays and favorite restaurants and who was beefing with who. I made sure people ate. I made sure meetings happened on time. I was infrastructure, and when everything collapsed, infrastructure doesn't get protection. Infrastructure just stands there in the rubble, trying to figure out what it's supposed to hold up now. It was October. I remember because the leaves were changing and I kept thinking how strange it was that the world just continued like that. Seasons moving forward while everything else stopped. I woke up that morning and my phone was dead. Not the battery. Dead like disconnected. I tried calling out and got nothing. Tried calling Frank's driver, nothing. Tried calling Rita who handled the weekend houses, nothing. Just silence where there used to be constant noise. I turned on the television and that's when I saw it. The footage. Federal agents, dozens of them, coordinated raids across 3 states. They were showing an apartment I recognized, one I'd been to maybe 20 times, furniture being carried out in boxes, people in handcuffs being walked to cars. The news anchor was calling it the biggest heroin bust in New York history. They said the word heroin like it explained everything, like that one word contained the whole story. But it didn't explain anything. It didn't explain what happens next to the people who weren't in handcuffs. The people whose phones just stopped working. I sat there for 3 hours watching the same footage loop. Waiting for someone to call. Waiting for instructions. That's what you do when you're infrastructure. You wait to be told what to hold up. But nobody called. And that silence was louder than any police siren could have been. The first thing that hits you is confusion. Not fear yet. Just profound confusion. Like waking up in a house you've lived in for years and suddenly all the furniture is gone. You know you're in the right place but nothing makes sense. I kept checking my phone even though I knew it was dead. Kept walking to the window like maybe someone would pull up outside. Kept waiting for the world to reorganize itself into something I understood. By the second day, the confusion started turning into something else. Fear, yes, but also something more specific. Abandonment. That's what it felt like. Like being a child in a department store and you turn around and your mother's gone and you're surrounded by strangers. Except I was 31 years old and the strangers were federal agents and lawyers and journalists and people from the neighborhood who suddenly wanted to know what I knew. I didn't leave my apartment for 4 days. I had maybe $200 in cash and half a refrigerator of food. I rationed it like I was preparing for a siege. In a way, I was. I didn't know who was watching. Didn't know if the phones were tapped, if the building was being surveilled, if every person I saw on the street was an undercover agent or an informant or just someone trying to figure out where the money was hidden, because that's what everyone wanted to know. Where's the money? Like it was just sitting somewhere in neat stacks waiting to be collected. Like empires keep their cash in a savings account. The truth was more complicated and more simple at the same time. The money was everywhere and nowhere. It was in cars and houses and businesses and safety deposit boxes and people's mattresses and offshore accounts nobody could touch and investments that looked legitimate on paper. It was distributed, diversified, hidden in plain sight. And most of it became completely inaccessible the moment the arrests happened. Frozen accounts. Seized properties. Lawyers taking their fees up front. Everyone who knew how to access anything suddenly gone or uncontactable or in custody. I had worked for almost 3 years and I had maybe $8,000 saved. In cash, hidden in my apartment in 3 different places because I'd learned you never keep everything together. $8,000. That was my cut of an empire. That was what infrastructure gets. On the 5th day, I saw Maria. She'd been with Frank's cousin, one of the main distributors in the Bronx. I saw her at the bodega on 145th, looking thin and scared, buying cigarettes with change. We made eye contact and I watched her decide whether to acknowledge me. She did, barely. A tiny nod. We walked together for half a block without talking. Finally she said, "They froze everything." I said, "I know." She said, "No, you don't know." Everything. The apartment. The car. The bank account he had in my name. They took my car. I drove it to the grocery store and when I came out, it was gone. Just gone. Towed by federal agents. There was a notice on the ground where it had been parked. I didn't know what to say. She kept walking. She said, "I have 2 kids. I have 2 kids and my car is gone and the apartment is in his name and I have $600 and no job and nobody will call me back." You know what I did yesterday? I applied to work at McDonald's. And they asked me for references. References. Who am I supposed to use as a reference? We stopped at the corner. She was crying, but in that way where you're trying not to, where your face is doing things you can't control but you're not making any sound. I wanted to hug her but I didn't. We weren't those kinds of people. We were infrastructure. Infrastructure doesn't break down in public. She said, everybody disappeared. Everybody. Like they were never there. And we're just supposed to what? Figure it out. I watched her walk away and I knew I'd probably never see her again. I was right. I heard later she moved back to Puerto Rico, back to family she hadn't spoken to in a decade. I heard her kids stayed with their grandmother while she worked 3 jobs trying to rebuild something. I heard a lot of things later. Most of them were worse than that. The thing about protection is you don't realize how much you're living under it until it's gone. I don't mean protection like bodyguards or security, though that existed too. I mean the invisible kind. The kind where people know who you're connected to and they leave you alone. Where landlords don't ask too many questions because they know. Where cops look the other way because they're getting paid to look the other way. Where your name means something even though you're nobody. When that disappears, everything feels different. The streets feel different. The way people look at you changes. I started noticing how many unmarked cars were parked on my block. Started recognizing the same faces in different places, people who were a little too interested in their newspapers, who sat in coffee shops too long without ordering anything. Maybe I was paranoid. Probably I was paranoid. But probably some of it was real too. I'd been careful for 3 years. Never talked on phones about anything real. Never wrote anything down. Never asked questions I didn't need answers to. I thought that carefulness would protect me. But it turns out the only thing carefulness does is make you aware of how much danger you've been in the whole time. I got a visit on day 7. 2 federal agents, a man and a woman, both young, both dressed like they were trying to look casual and missing by about 6 inches. They knocked on my door at 8 in the morning. I knew who they were before I opened it. You develop an instinct for these things. The woman did most of the talking. She said they just wanted to ask me a few questions. She said I wasn't under investigation. She said they knew I was peripheral to the organization and they just needed to establish some timelines. Some connections. She said it would be easier if I cooperated now rather than later. She said a lot of things, all of them designed to sound friendly and reasonable and completely non-threatening. I said I wanted a lawyer. It's the only thing you're supposed to say. Everyone knows this. But what they don't tell you is how guilty that makes you feel, how confrontational it sounds, how the agents' faces change when you say it. Like you've just confirmed something they suspected. The man spoke then. He said, "You're not under arrest. You don't need a lawyer for a conversation." I said, "Then we're not having a conversation." They left a card with a phone number. They said I should think about it. They said things would be easier if I called them before they had to come back. They said it in a way that made it clear they would come back. I closed the door and sat on the floor with my back against it for 20 minutes. My hands were shaking. I couldn't tell if I'd done the right thing or the worst possible thing. Don't talk and you're obstructing justice. Every choice feels like it might be the one that destroys you. Don't cooperate and you're protecting criminals. There's no right answer. There's just whatever you can live with. I called a lawyer that afternoon. Not one of the ones from the organization, those were all busy defending people who could pay their fees. I called a guy my cousin knew, a defense attorney in the Bronx who handled smaller cases. He agreed to meet me for a consultation. $300 just to talk for an hour. I paid him in cash from my hidden stash. He told me what I already knew. Don't talk to anyone. Don't answer questions. Don't try to be helpful. Assume everything is being recorded. Assume everyone is trying to build a case. Trust no one, he said. The good news is they probably don't have anything on you or they would have arrested you already. The bad news is they're going to keep trying. They'll pressure you. They'll make it seem like everyone else is cooperating and you're the only one holding out. They'll tell you you're going to prison if you don't help them. They'll tell you helping them is the only way to protect yourself. None of it's true. They're just trying to scare you into making a mistake. I said, "What if I can't afford you? What if this goes on for months?" He looked at me with something like pity. He said, "Then you're going to have to be very, very careful." The neighborhood started changing. People disappeared. Not arrested, just gone. People who'd been around for years suddenly weren't there anymore. Buildings that used to feel busy felt empty. Businesses closed. The barbershop where Frank used to get his hair cut shut down. The restaurant where people had meetings became a vacant storefront with soap on the windows. It was like watching a time-lapse of decay. Everything that had been held up by money and power just collapsed the moment that support was removed, and the people who stayed started acting different. Paranoid. Suspicious. Nobody talked to anyone. Eye contact became dangerous. You'd see someone you knew and you'd both pretend you didn't see each other because acknowledging each other meant acknowledging you were both still there. Still connected to something that no longer existed. I ran into Jerome at the post office. He'd been a driver, low-level, someone who moved packages and asked no questions. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in 2 weeks. He saw me and his face did this complicated thing where I could see him calculating the risk of talking to me versus the risk of ignoring me. He said, very quietly, "You okay?" I said, "Yeah." "You?" he said, "I'm working at my brother-in-law's garage. Under the table. Cash only. Trying to stay invisible, you know." I said I knew. He said, "They came to my house. Asked me questions about routes, about schedules. I told them I just drove where I was told. I don't know if they believed me." I asked if he'd gotten a lawyer. He laughed, bitter. He said, "With what money?" My public defender told me to cooperate. Said I'd be facing conspiracy charges if I didn't help them build their case. But if I cooperate, I'm dead. Not legally. Really dead. So I'm just hoping they forget about me. Hoping I'm too small to matter, we stood there in line pretending to look at our phones. Just before he left, he said, "You know what the worst part is? I made good money for 2 years. Best money I ever made. And I've got nothing to show for it. Nothing. Spent it as fast as it came in because I thought it would always be coming in. Now I'm 42 years old working at a garage for $12 an hour and looking over my shoulder every time I hear a siren. That's what I've got to show for it. Fear and $12 an hour, that was the last time I saw Jerome. I heard later he got picked up on an old warrant, something completely unrelated to Frank or the organization. Last I knew he was in Rikers waiting for trial. That's how it went for a lot of people. Even if the federal case didn't get you, something else did. Outstanding tickets, probation violations, immigration issues, child support, whatever. The feds would call local police departments, mention names, and suddenly old warrants would get activated. It was a way of applying pressure without filing new charges. It was effective, the money turned cold. That's the only way to describe it. Money that used to flow freely, that used to be abundant and available and easy, just stopped. And what was left became dangerous to touch. I had my $8,000 hidden in my apartment, and every time I took money out to pay for food or rent, I worried that somehow that cash was marked, that spending it would signal something to someone. I started going to different neighborhoods to shop, paying with small bills, never spending more than $20 at once. It made my money last longer, but it also made everything harder. I heard stories about people who had access to real money, significant amounts, who couldn't touch it. Safety deposit boxes they were afraid to visit because banks were being watched. Cash hidden in houses that had been seized. Money in accounts that were frozen. One woman, I won't say her name, she knew where her boyfriend had hidden almost $100,000. She knew the location, knew how to access it. But she couldn't get near it because federal agents were watching the property. She ended up on welfare, living in a shelter with her daughter, while money she could have used to rebuild her life sat untouched in a wall somewhere in Queens. The psychological cost of that kind of proximity to money you can't access is hard to explain. It's not the same as being broke when you never had anything. It's knowing that relief exists, that security exists, that it's right there. And you can't reach it. It makes everything else feel more desperate. I got a job after 3 weeks. Receptionist at a dental office in Westchester. I lied on the application about where I'd been working for the past 3 years. Said I was a secretary at a real estate company that had gone out of business. Nobody checked. The job paid $12 an hour. My rent was $800 a month. You do the math. I was surviving on my hidden money while making just enough to not look completely desperate. The office manager was a woman named Diane, 50s, efficient, no nonsense. She liked that I was quiet and punctual and didn't ask for time off. I liked that she didn't ask questions about my life. We had a functional relationship built on mutual disinterest. It was the safest kind of relationship I could have, but even there, I couldn't fully relax. I was constantly worried that someone would recognize me, that a patient would turn out to be connected to law enforcement, that my fake employment history would somehow be verified. Every time the phone rang, I worried it was the feds calling to schedule an appointment just to see if I was really working there. Paranoia becomes your baseline. You can't turn it off. 3 months in, I had a panic attack at work. A patient came in, a black man in his 40s wearing a nice suit, and something about the way he looked at me made me certain he was a federal agent. My chest tightened. My hands started shaking. I excused myself to the bathroom and sat on the floor trying to breathe. It took me 20 minutes to calm down enough to go back out. The man turned out to be a high school principal getting a root canal. He was polite and uninterested in me. But I couldn't shake the fear. It had embedded itself in me by then. It lived in my body. People started talking. Not to the feds necessarily, though some did that too. But to each other. Rumors spreading about who was cooperating, who was snitching, who could still be trusted. The thing about rumors is you can't verify them. Someone would say they heard from someone who heard from someone that so-and-so was meeting with prosecutors. Maybe it was true. Maybe it wasn't. But once the rumor existed, it might as well have been true because that person was marked. Nobody would talk to them. Nobody would help them. They became invisible in a different way. I heard my name in a rumor once. Someone told someone who told someone else that I was talking to federal agents. It wasn't true. The only contact I'd had was that one visit where I asked for a lawyer. But the rumor existed anyway. I found out because a woman I barely knew, someone who used to work at one of the fronts, cornered me in a subway station. She didn't threaten me exactly. She just made it very clear that she knew where I worked, where I lived, that I should be careful about what I said and to who. Her voice was calm. Her eyes were not. I said, I haven't talked to anyone. I got a lawyer and I haven't said a word. She said, good. Keep it that way. That was it. She walked away. But I knew what it meant. It meant I was being watched by both sides now. Feds on one side, the remnants of the organization on the other. Both sides assuming I knew more than I did, that I was more important than I was. Infrastructure. Essential but replaceable. Except now I was infrastructure with nowhere to be placed. I stopped going to my old neighborhood except when absolutely necessary. Stopped taking the same routes. Changed where I bought groceries, where I did laundry, where I picked up prescriptions. I became a ghost in my own life, moving through spaces without leaving an impression. The lawyers made money. That's the only certainty in the whole thing. While everyone else lost everything, the lawyers got richer. Every person arrested needed representation. Every person questioned needed advice. Every seized asset needed someone to argue against the seizure. They got public defenders who were overworked and underpaid and handling 30 cases Frank's at main once. attorney was I charging saw Frank's $1,500 an hour, leaving the courthouse in Manhattan. Most of the smaller operators
He was wearing
couldn't
a suit
afford
that
probably
private
cost
attorneys at
more
all.
than my yearly salary. He was on his phone, laughing about something. He got into a black car with a driver. I stood there on the courthouse steps watching him leave and I thought, he's the only one who came out ahead. The only one. The trial started 6 months later. I didn't go. Didn't want to be seen anywhere near a courthouse. But I followed them in the news. The coverage was relentless. Every detail of the operation dissected in public. Every connection traced. Every dollar accounted for. The prosecution presented charts and timelines and recordings. They brought in witnesses, most of them low-level operators who took plea deals in exchange for testimony. They presented evidence I didn't know existed, surveillance I didn't know was happening. It was like watching someone open up a body and display all the organs. This is how it worked. This is how it functioned. This is what kept it alive. Frank was sentenced to 70 years. He got out after 15 due to cooperation, but that's a different story. At the time, 70 years felt like forever. It felt like an ending. The news presented it that way. Justice served. Empire dismantled. Community saved, but in my apartment in Westchester. Working my receptionist job, avoiding eye contact on the subway, jumping every time someone knocked on my door, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the middle of something that would never resolve. A year in, I started seeing a therapist. I couldn't afford it, but I went anyway, paying on a sliding scale based on income. I told her I'd been adjacent to something dangerous and now I was trying to build a normal life, but I couldn't stop feeling afraid. I didn't tell her details. Didn't mention names. Just the outline. Just enough for her to understand why I kept having panic attacks in grocery stores. She said, "You're experiencing post-traumatic stress. Your body learned to exist in a state of constant vigilance and it doesn't know how to turn that off." I said, "How long does it last?" She said, "It depends. With treatment, with time, with safety, it can get better. But the neural pathways are there now. Your brain has been rewired to expect danger. That doesn't just disappear." I went to therapy for 8 months before I couldn't afford it anymore. It helped, marginally. Gave me language for what I was experiencing. Gave me techniques for managing panic. But it didn't make me feel safe. Nothing made me feel safe. People forget that criminal organizations are ecosystems. When they collapse, everything collapses. The obvious parts, yes, the dealers and the enforcers and the money people. But also the peripheral infrastructure. The restaurants that stayed open because they had guaranteed customers. The landlords who collected rent from fronts. The car services that got paid in cash. The bodegas that looked the other way. All of that goes away. And the people who depended on that ecosystem, even tangentially, they fall too. I watched my old neighborhood decline over the next 2 years. Businesses closed. Buildings fell into disrepair. Crime actually went up because the organized crime was gone and what replaced it was disorganized, chaotic, desperate. Frank's organization had rules, boundaries, a structure. What came after had none of that. It was just people trying to survive, trying to make money however they could. With no system to control it, I heard a community activist on the news saying how glad she was the drug dealers were gone, how the neighborhood could finally heal. I understood what she meant. I did. But I also knew what she didn't see. The women like Maria who lost everything. The drivers like Jerome who ended up in worse places. The kids who had food and clothes and tuition paid for who suddenly didn't. The complexity underneath the headline. The human cost that came after the arrests, not because of the crime but because of the collapse. I'm not saying it was good. I'm not saying it should have continued. I'm saying it was complicated and the complexity didn't make the news. I met someone 3 years later. His name was David. He worked in IT, normal job, normal life. We met at a coffee shop. He was kind and stable and completely uninterested in anything illegal. He didn't ask many questions about my past and I didn't volunteer much. I told him I'd had a complicated few years and was rebuilding. He accepted that. We dated for almost a year before I told him anything real. And even then, I didn't tell him everything. I told him I'd worked for someone who turned out to be involved in organized crime, that I hadn't known the full extent of what was happening, that I'd gotten out before anything serious happened. It was a sanitized version. A version that made me sympathetic instead of complicit. He said, "That must have been scary." I said, "It was." He said, "But you're safe now." I wanted to believe him. I wanted that to be true. But I'd learned that safety was provisional, that it could disappear overnight, that you could wake up one morning and discover the structure holding up your life had collapsed while you were sleeping. We broke up 6 months later. Not because of anything dramatic. Just because I couldn't let him in completely and he could feel it. He said it was like there was a wall between us, like I was always holding something back. He wasn't wrong. I was. I am. I still don't know how to be fully honest with someone without making them complicit in my history. So I keep parts of myself hidden. Infrastructure. Essential but replaceable. Even in love, I saw Rita once, 5 years after everything collapsed. I was in Manhattan for a dentist appointment, my own dentist this time, not the office where I worked. I was walking through Midtown and I saw her coming out of an office building. She looked older but good, professional, like she'd rebuilt something substantial. We recognized each other immediately. There was this moment where we both stopped, both trying to decide if we should acknowledge each other. She decided first. She walked over, she said, "Hey," I said, "Hey," she said, "You look good." "You doing okay?" I said, "Yeah. Working. Living in Westchester." "You?" she said, "I went back to school. Got a degree in accounting. Working for a real estate firm now. Legitimate. Boring. Stable," I said. "That's good," she said. "It is, actually. I'm making less money than I used to, but I sleep at night, you know? I don't look over my shoulder anymore. Took me years to get there, but I'm there." We stood there in the middle of the sidewalk with people flowing around us. After a while she said, "You ever think about it?" "About that time?" I said, "Every day." She nodded. She said, "Me too. I dream about it sometimes. Not nightmares exactly. Just dreams where I'm back there, back in that world, and I'm trying to leave but I can't find the door. And I wake up and I'm so relieved I'm here, in this boring stable life. But there's also this weird grief, you know? For something that was terrible but was also the most alive I've ever felt." I knew exactly what she meant. I didn't know how to say it but I knew. She said, "You ever talk to anyone from back then?" I said, "No." "You?" she said, "No. I think everyone just disappeared into their own lives. Trying to forget. Trying to become different people." She gave me her number. Said I should call her sometime, maybe get coffee. I said I would. We both knew I wouldn't. Some things you can't go back to, not even for coffee. I'm 47 now. It's been 16 years since the arrests. 16 years since the phones went dead and the empire collapsed. I still work as a receptionist, different office now, better pay. I live alone in a one-bedroom apartment in Yonkers. I have a retirement account and health insurance and a quiet life that doesn't make demands I can't meet. I don't tell people about those 3 years. Most people in my current life don't even know I lived in Harlem, don't know I was anywhere near that world. When Frank Lucas died in 2019, I saw the news coverage and the obituaries and the think pieces about his legacy. I watched American Gangster years ago and saw a version of events that was simultaneously accurate and completely false. The bones of the story were there, but the tissue, the daily reality, the complexity of complicity, none of that made it in. No one wants to hear about the aftermath. The movies end with arrests. The documentaries end with sentencing. The story is supposed to be over. Justice served. Roll credits. But for those of us who lived through what came next, the story kept going. It's still going. I still have moments of panic. Sirens still make my heart race. Unexpected knocks on the door still send me into hyper-alert mode. I still scan every new environment, but I've also learned to live with people who might recognize me. The fear becomes background noise instead of a constant siren. The neural pathways, the vigilance becomes habit instead of panic. The body remembers even when you're trying to forget. Humans are good at adjusting. We survive things we thought would destroy us and then we build new lives on top of the wreckage. Sometimes I think about Maria and her kids. I think about Jerome and Rikers. I think about all the people whose names I never learned, who were even more peripheral than I was, who fell even further. I think about the woman who couldn't access the $100,000 hidden in the wall. I think about all the small tragedies that never made the news, never got acknowledged, never became part of the official story. And I think about Frank. Not with anger or bitterness or even judgment really. Just with this complicated awareness that he built something that provided for hundreds of people, that employed them and protected them and gave them a structure to exist within. And when that structure collapsed, all those people fell. Not because they were arrested. Because they weren't. Because they were just infrastructure, and infrastructure doesn't get endings, doesn't get closure, doesn't get witness protection or book deals or movie rights. Infrastructure just gets forgotten. That's the real punishment. Not prison. Not fines. Not even the fear or the loss of money or the years spent looking over your shoulder. The real punishment is irrelevance. It's watching your own story get erased in favor of simpler narratives. It's knowing that your experience, your survival, your reconstruction of a life from nothing, none of it matters enough to be told, so I'm telling it now. Not for vindication or sympathy or understanding. Just to say it existed. We existed. The aftermath existed. The women and the drivers and the people who answered phones and ran errands and kept things functioning. We were real. Our fear was real. Our losses were real. Our survival was real, and when you watch those documentaries or read those books or see those movies about Frank Lucas and his empire, remember that the empire fell on people. Remember that infrastructure is made of human beings. Remember that for every dramatic arrest caught on camera, there were dozens of people standing in the wreckage afterward, trying to figure out how to survive in a world that had just stopped making sense. That's the story no one tells. The boring aftermath. The slow rebuilding. The quiet fear that never quite goes away. The ordinary life constructed carefully on top of buried trauma. That's what it actually means when an empire falls, not the arrests. Not the headlines. Not the sentencing, what comes after, what we're still living through, what remains.